was the summer of 1347. The world had already begun to feel a sense of unease. People lived in a time of many unknown diseases. Famine and wars seemed like everyday occurrences, but nothing could have prepared them for what was to come. In the bustling cities and villages across Europe, people were unaware that something darker and more ominous than anything they had ever known was about to descend upon them. It began quietly, as these things often do, in a distant land far from Europe. It was in Asia, in the heart of the Mongol Empire, where the first whispers of the plague began to spread. Caravans and traders, unaware of the threat they carried, moved across trade routes, unknowingly transporting the disease from Asia to Europe. Ships laden with goods from the east sailed across the Mediterranean, unwittingly bringing death with them. The first signs of the Black Death were subtle. There were rumor stories from far-off lands about a mysterious illness that was ravaging populations. It started with the appearance of strange, dark boils appearing on the skin of the infected. People would develop fever and experience severe body pain, sometimes feeling as though their bones were breaking from the inside. Those who contracted the illness would not live long, often succumbing within days. The air was thick with fear and confusion. One could imagine the confusion in the small towns and villages of Europe. It all began slowly first, a few deaths. Here and there, an illness that spread through a family or a group of friends. No one knew why it was happening, why some people died and others didn't. The symptoms were terrifying. Buboes painful, swollen lumps appeared on the neck, armpits, and groin, their size increasing rapidly. The skin would darken, turning a sickly shade of black or purple, hence the name Black Death. In those early days, no one knew what was causing this devastating illness. Was it a curse, a punishment from God? Was it witches or demons at work? People turned to their faith, seeking answers in prayer, begging for divine mercy. But the disease spread relentlessly. Panic took hold. In some places, entire villages were wiped out in a matter of days, leaving behind empty homes and fields. In the cities, where life was already crowded and unsanitary, the disease spread faster. With people living in close quarters, with waste piling up on the streets, and with limited knowledge of hygiene, the disease found fertile ground. Markets, once bustling with life, began to empty. The city's vibrancy, its people laughing, shouting, and trading goods, faded into eerie silence. The air seemed thick with an unspoken terror. Imagine then being one of the common folk in a small medieval town. Life had been difficult, already meager rations, the constant struggle against famine, and the threat of war in nearby regions. But now, there was an invisible enemy creeping through the streets. As the disease claimed the lives of the people, families began to fear one another. Neighbors stopped visiting. Parents abandoned their children. Spouses left each other, terrified that the other was infected. The atmosphere was one of dread and confusion. People didn't know how to prevent it, and they didn't know how to stop it. Every cough, every sneeze, was a potential sign of the disease. And soon, it wasn't just a handful of deaths. It was dozens, then hundreds. The air was thick with mourning. But death, strange as it seems, became a part of the everyday life. As horrific as it was, it became a kind of normality in itself. In the villages, where the population was smaller and the bonds of community were stronger, the sense of fear was compounded by a lack of understanding. The peasants, for whom the cycle of planting and harvesting was a way of life, now saw their friends and loved ones fall ill without explanation. They would bury their dead hastily, often unable to conduct proper rites for fear of their own mortality. The land was still fertile, but the workers were fewer. Crops rotted in the fields, untouched by human hands. In the larger towns and cities, those who had the means fled. The wealthy, the merchants, and the powerful left the crowded cities for the countryside in hopes of escaping the plague. But it was no use. The disease traveled faster than they could run, infecting villages that were once untouched by the urban chaos. Even kings, queens, and nobles were not immune. There were those who tried to make sense of what was happening. Some people believed the plague was a punishment for humanity's sins, and so they resorted to extreme measures to seek forgiveness. For example, would publicly flog themselves in the streets, believing that their suffering would appease God. Others blamed minorities, such as Jews, accusing them of poisoning the wells. This irrational fear led to violent anti-Semitic riots in some parts of Europe, with innocent people being murdered in the belief that they were the cause of the plague. As the weeks turned into months, the death toll continued to climb. The Black Death was a shadow that loomed over every city, every village, and every home. People tried their best to go on with their lives, but the atmosphere was one of desperation. Life had become fragile. The future, once taken for granted, now seemed uncertain, and death was always just around the corner. The Black Death was the great equalizer, sparing neither the rich nor the poor, the powerful nor the powerless. It took no heed of rank, wealth, or status. Everyone was vulnerable. As the days passed, the plague began to take a firmer grip on Europe. It spread like wildfire, moving from the Mediterranean coast into the heart of Italy, and from there into the rest of Europe. The towns and villages that were once lively and bustling with daily activities now became silent and still. What had started as a few isolated cases soon turned into a widespread epidemic, claiming countless lives with terrifying speed. It was the summer of 1348, when the Black Death truly began to spread across Europe. It came with no warning, no herald, to announce its arrival. The disease seemed to appear out of nowhere. One by one, villages fell silent as their inhabitants succumbed to the illness. The streets, once filled with the sounds of life, now echoed with the silence of death. The few who remained were left to face an uncertain fate. People did not know where the disease had come from, nor did they understand how it spread. At first, some believed it was the result of bad air miasma, a poisonous vapor that they thought could infect people when they breathed it in. Others thought it was divine punishment, an act of God's wrath for the sins of humanity. There were even rumors that the Jews had poisoned the wells, causing riots against them in several European cities. But no matter the cause, the result was the same. The Black Death left destruction in its wake. The symptoms of the plague were unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. The first sign was the appearance of dark, swollen boils buboes around the groin, armpits, or neck. These were painful and growing rapidly. The body would also develop a high fever, chills, and severe aches, as though the person's bones were being crushed from the inside. The pain was excruciating, and within hours or days, the person would be dead. For some, the infection spread so quickly that they died before they even had time to fully realize what was happening. At first, the disease spread mostly through trade routes, following the movement of merchants and travelers who unknowingly carried the plague with them. Ships carrying goods from the east brought with them not just spices and silks, but also rats, which carried the fleas that transmitted the disease. As the ships docked at Mediterranean ports like Genoa and Venice, the plague made its first appearance. In Europe, from there, it traveled inland, moving swiftly along trade routes, and soon, the cities were filled with the infected. It didn't take long for the disease to reach the towns and villages in the countryside. The rural peasants, who had once lived peaceful lives, were suddenly confronted with the full force of the plague. There were no medical remedies, no understanding of the disease's origins, and no one knew how to stop it. The only choice was to isolate oneself and hope that the disease would pass by. In villages, where the plague had already taken hold, families turned against each other. The fear of being infected led to abandonment. Parents left their children, terrified that the plague would spread to them. Neighbors stopped speaking to each other. Entire families died, and the bodies were left unburied, sometimes for days. In the belief that any contact would bring certain death, it was a strange, cruel isolation that affected everyone, whether they were infected or not. The streets of the villages, once vibrant with daily activity, were now eerily empty. The few people who remained would take cautious steps, moving only to tend to the animals or to grab what little food they could find. In some places, entire households disappeared overnight, leaving nothing but empty homes and the smell of death lingering in the air. Those who could flee did so, retreating into the countryside in hopes of escaping the disease. But the plague followed, reaching into every corner of the land in cities like Florence, Paris, and London. The plague caused widespread panic. In the churches, people knelt in desperate prayer, begging for mercy. Monks, priests, and clergy, who had always been seen as protectors, were not immune. Many died while attempting to care for the sick, spreading the disease further. Entire families were wiped out in a matter of days, and businesses, once thriving, were now closed. Those who could afford to flee the cities did so, leaving the poor behind to fend for themselves. As the disease ravaged Europe, people began to turn on each other. The wealthy, who had the means to escape the cities, often abandoned their servants and workers. Fear drove communities to turn inward, isolating themselves from others. The social fabric began to unravel as people became desperate to save themselves. Those who were left behind had no choice but to deal with the bodies of the dead, hauling them to mass graves, sometimes without ceremony, sometimes without even knowing who the dead had been. But there was little escape from the plague. Even in the countryside, where life had once seemed more peaceful, people could not outrun the terror that was sweeping across the land. The disease found its way into even the most remote hamlets, leaving devastation in its wake. It was said that entire villages disappeared, leaving behind only the silence of the abandoned homes. In the midst of the devastation, there were moments of strange behavior and hopeless acts. People in some places resorted to extreme measures to try to protect themselves. Some wore strange masks filled with herbs and spices, believing that the sweet smells would protect them from the plague. Others, overwhelmed by fear, would retreat into their homes, barricading themselves inside and praying for divine intervention. No one knew what to do, and the uncertainty was as dangerous as the disease itself. People who once shared food, warmth, and companionship now kept to themselves, afraid of even the smallest interaction. The villages were broken, and the bonds of community that once defined life were eroded by fear and confusion. The wealthy who could afford it began to flee, leaving behind the poorest to face the brunt of the disease. But in the end, no one was safe. The plague didn't care about wealth or status. It killed everyone, regardless of their place in society. As the weeks turned to months, and the months to years, Europe was left to pick up the pieces. It would take generations for the full toll of the Black Death to be understood, but for those who lived through it, the memories of the fear, the loss, and the endless death would remain for a lifetime. As the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, the Black Death continued its relentless spread, ravaging one village after another, one city after another. The grief that enveloped Europe was profound, and for the people who lived through it, each day brought new challenges and new losses. It wasn't just the physical toll of the disease that took its toll, it was the psychological and emotional weight of a world that seemed to be coming to an end. There was no place to hide. People of all ages, all classes, and all walks of life were affected by the plague. Children, who were once the joy of their families, now lay alongside their elders, the death toll growing ever higher. Families were torn apart, and in some cases, entire families perished together. The pain of losing a loved one, of seeing them succumb to the disease in such a horrifying way, was indescribable. But for many, this loss was only the beginning. In the villages, where the sense of community had once been strong, there was now an overwhelming sense of isolation. Those who were healthy, and many were afraid to admit they were healthy for fear of becoming targets, retreated into their homes. Neighbors no longer spoke to one another, not for lack of kindness, but because the fear of contagion had driven them apart. The warmth of community, of shared meals and laughter, was replaced by the cold silence of fear and uncertainty. There was no one to talk to, no one to share the burden with. Even the simple act of burying the dead became a monumental task. It was no longer a communal responsibility, but an overwhelming one. There was no time to prepare for the deceased, as had been customary in the past. Bodies piled up quickly, and the idea of a proper burial was often abandoned in favor of quickly digging mass graves. In some places, there simply weren't enough hands to carry the bodies to the graves. In others, the sheer number of dead was so great that the living were overwhelmed by the task of digging enough graves for the dead. In some parts of Europe, it was said that the dead were simply tossed into pits with no ceremony, no prayers spoken over them, their names forgotten. In the chaos, the pain of loss was compounded by the uncertainty of the future. The disease didn't just strike once and then fade away. It came in waves, sometimes retreating for a brief period only to return more ferociously. Those who had survived the first wave of the disease lived in constant dread of its return. There was no comfort, no refuge. Even the wealthiest couldn't protect themselves from the disease. Houses that had once been filled with guests, feasts, and laughter were now empty. The doors locked and shuttered in an attempt to keep the disease at bay. People had no idea how the plague was spreading, and no idea how to stop it. Theories abounded. Some said it was a punishment from God for humanity's sins, and some turned to religious rituals in desperation, hoping that fasting, praying, or attending Mass would save them. The Church, struggling with its own survival, offered little help, other than to pray for salvation. Even the clergy weren't immune, and in some areas, entire orders of monks and priests were wiped out by the disease. The absence of medical knowledge was a powerful blow during this time. Without an understanding of how diseases spread, people turned to whatever remedies they could find, many of which were useless or harmful. Some believed that inhaling strong-smelling substances like garlic or burning incense would purify the air, while others attempted to bleed the sick, believing that drawing out blood could remove the disease. These treatments were often more damaging than helpful. Yet, in the face of fear and hopelessness, many were willing to try anything. For some, the trauma of losing loved ones became unbearable. Grief turned into panic, and panic into madness. In some places, people abandoned their homes and fled into the wilderness, hoping to escape the disease. Families were divided, never to see each other again. Some, in their desperation, resorted to irrational actions, such as turning to extreme measures of self-punishment in an attempt to redeem themselves. The flagellants, a group of religious zealots, made their way through the streets, whipping themselves in public displays of penance, believing that by punishing their own bodies, they could appease God and stop the plague. Meanwhile, in the cities, where the population density was greater, the situation became even more dire. The disease seemed to move faster in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Markets that had once thrived with commerce were now deserted. Shops were shuttered. The air was filled with the stench of decay as bodies lay unburied for days, and the scent of death permeated every corner of the city. The rich fled to the countryside, leaving the poor to fend for themselves. Those who could afford it retreated behind the walls of their estates, barricading themselves from the suffering of the streets. Yet even in the midst of such tragedy, some remained hopeful. There were still those who, in spite of the fear and uncertainty, believed that life would continue. People came together in small ways, helping one another, offering what little they had to those who were worse off. In some villages, survivors would help bury the dead, and in others, they would bring food or water to those who were too weak to leave their homes. But for many, the sense of hopelessness was overwhelming. The disease didn't discriminate. It came for everyone, regardless of age, wealth, or station in life. The survivors of the Black Death were often left with nothing but the memory of their losses, the knowledge that they had lived through something unimaginable, and the struggle to rebuild from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The Black Death didn't just take lives, it took communities, families, and entire ways of life. It shattered the foundations of society and left the survivors with nothing but the haunting memory of what had once been. When the Black Death finally began to subside, it left behind a Europe fundamentally altered, scarred both physically and emotionally. Entire villages had been wiped out, and cities lay in ruin. The air was still thick with the smell of death, and the living were left to confront the task of rebuilding from the ashes of a society that had once been thriving but now stood in tatters. The survivors, exhausted and mourning, had to face a new reality, a world where nothing could return to what it once was. In the days following the plague's first devastating waves, those who remained were often too numb to feel the depth of the destruction around them. The weight of what had happened was too immense to comprehend fully. It wasn't just the loss of family and friends, it was the loss of entire communities. Ways of life and traditions that had existed for centuries. The rhythm of the seasons, once dictated by the labor of the people, was now disrupted, and the fields, left untended, lay fallow. The first step, for most, was simply survival. The devastation of the Black Death had left a gaping hole in Europe's population. An estimated 1/3 of the population had perished, perhaps even more. In cities like Florence, Paris, and London, this death toll meant that entire neighborhoods were wiped out. The wealthy and the noble had fled, leaving behind the poor who had no means of escape. These poor souls, left to manage the cities' remnants, faced new challenges in addition to the plague itself. Disease, famine, and extreme social upheaval were now the backdrop of their lives. At first, many survivors struggled with the practicalities of daily life. With so many dead, it was difficult to find enough laborers to tend to the crops. Fields, once fertile and well-maintained, now lay untended, overgrown with weeds. The animals that had been raised for food had died or been abandoned, and there were not enough hands to replace them. Villages that had once been prosperous were now ghost towns. The survivors, left with few resources, faced a grim future. What could they rebuild from? Yet, despite the devastation, humanity is, by nature, resilient. Slowly, the survivors began to rebuild. With so much land now vacant and so few people left to work it, there was a strange opportunity for those who had survived to reclaim and cultivate the land. New opportunities arose, particularly for those who had been previously bound by the rigid social structures of the medieval world. For the peasantry, the Black Death had, in many ways, given them newfound power. The scarcity of labor meant that peasants who had once lived under the thumb of wealthy landowners now had more leverage. They could demand higher wages for their labor, and in some cases, entire villages, once dominated by the nobility, were able to break free from old feudal obligations. The death of so many of the wealthy landowners meant that there was more land to be worked and more opportunity for those who remained to rebuild their lives. But the rebuilding process was not an easy one. Survivors had to deal with the emotional toll of losing loved ones, often without any form of closure. The emotional scars of the plague ran deep. Grief was a constant companion. Even those who had survived with their families had lost friends, neighbors, and distant relatives. There was no room for mourning in the bustling days of work, but the sorrow lingered. What was once familiar now seemed alien. The streets, once filled with life and the hum of activity, now echoed with a silence that was both unsettling and peaceful at the same time. In the cities, the rebuilding began with the cleaning up of the bodies and the clearing of the dead. Mass graves were dug, and the bodies were placed in them without ceremony. Some of the wealthier survivors tried to bring life back to the cities by establishing new businesses or returning to their trade. But it was not as it had once been. The social fabric had been torn, and it would take years, even generations, for the world to return to anything resembling what had existed before. Meanwhile, the church, which had once been a source of both spiritual and political power, was struggling. The loss of so many of its members, including priests and monks, left a void in leadership. The church had failed to protect its people from the plague, and this failure led to a loss of faith for many. As survivors grappled with their grief and anger, some began to question the role of religion in their lives. The church, once seen as a refuge in times of crisis, was now seen by some as a symbol of failure. Others still clung to their faith, seeking solace in prayer, while some turned to new ideas, looking for answers that the church could not provide. Throughout Europe, a sense of pessimism hung in the air. For the survivors, the trauma of the plague would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The fear of another outbreak, the dread of the unknown, lingered in their hearts. Every cough, every fever, was a reminder that death could come at any time. Yet life moved forward. Slowly but surely, the pieces of society began to be put back together. For the survivors, the Black Death had fundamentally changed the way they viewed the world. No longer were they bound by the same old fears. Many began to take more risks, moving away from the old, feudal ways. There was a sense of liberation in this new world, where the old power structures had crumbled and the opportunities for a different kind of life were now possible. The Black Death also left its mark on art and culture. In the aftermath of the plague, the people of Europe began to express their grief and fear in ways that had not been seen before. There was a shift in the artistic expression of the time, with many artists focusing on the macabre, painting images of death and decay. The danse macabre, a motif that depicted death as a skeleton dancing with the living, became popular, reflecting the sense of inevitability that had taken root in the collective consciousness. In the coming years, survivors would carry these memories with them. They would rebuild their lives, but they would never forget the great loss. And so, Europe began to slowly recover. The population, which had been decimated, eventually began to grow again. Villages were repopulated, cities were rebuilt, and the land was once again worked. Yet, the scars of the Black Death remained, both in the landscape and in the hearts of those who had lived through it.